we hope for. Okay, so we're live on YouTube.
Right.
Dwayne Phillips is with us. Well, I'm gonna try to start letting people in. So now we're broadcasting also, and just want to wait until we get some more attendees in. They typically come in on time. And we did have a, yeah, total count was more than 30, but it's typically a third. Okay, yeah, there I see people are trickling in. Again, we'll wait a few more minutes to let everybody come in because we are a little bit early.
We are.
Yeah. And I hope everyone can hear us. If you can, please feel free to chat. I mean, the chat room is open. You can pose any questions, and we certainly will address them as we go along. Again, this will be it's usually a 30-minute session. We're going to keep it casual and very conversational. Christine is also joining us. Christine is one of our previous panelists. Thank you for joining us again. Dwayne Phillips is our guest, and Dwayne Phillips is the director of project management. He joins us from Grand Rapids, Michigan area. I see Alex also joined us, so looks like we have a few attendees. All our panelists are here, and the subject that we're going to be discussing today is the
Hey, everybody.
Oh, there's Alex. Say hello to everyone. Again, the subject matter is how do you effectively manage projects with remote workforce. I mean, we're still are mostly remote. Some of us are going in, and I think Dwayne just mentioned that he's a part of the essential workforce. So you have been going in, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over the stage to you, Dwayne, and you can certainly introduce yourself because I did a quick introduction, but why don't you go ahead and let us know a little bit about yourself and your background, maybe.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Yuri. I'd like to begin out by thanking both Yuri and Alex for inviting me, and looking forward to having a really good conversation with everybody. As mentioned earlier, my name is Dwayne Phillips. I'm a director of project management for a company called the Heidecker Wheat Lake Company. That's kind of a little bit of a mouthful, but that's a family-owned construction company that focuses on utility-based construction. So we do electric overhead, electric underground, we do transmission, we do substation distribution, basically whatever it takes to get electricity into your workplace, into your residence. That's the kind of work that we do. As a result of that, typically when natural disasters happen, we have a tendency to go to the problem area, not kind of go away from it. So even in this pandemic environment that we're in now, we are deemed as essential workers. Within probably about a day or two of making announcements, I had 20 or 30 letters in my hand from state agencies, federal agencies saying, yeah, you need to keep working. So for us, this pandemic, while it's had its real fair share of challenges, has not really reduced our workload overall. As a matter of fact, we've actually seen an increase in our workload when we look all across our operations. So as a director of project management, I run a team of 22 construction project managers. And what we want to talk about today is a little bit about how we effectively manage projects with a remote workforce. And specifically what I want to talk about are some lessons learned that we've had. So giving a little bit of a background as to our operations, if you will, as a construction of project managers, there's a certain amount of remoteness or virtual work that we do on a normal basis. Typically, that's about a 60% office work, about 40% field work. And that's a rough average across all of the project managers that I have working for me. Some are out in the field a little bit more, some are in the office a little bit more, but that gives you an idea that we're used to working in a remote environment to where we have to use conference calls or Microsoft Teams or whatever platform you use as a technology to be able to manage and communicate information to workers that are not necessarily there with you. But the new challenge is when we went with the pandemic, now we went from approximately a 40% remote workforce, or a workforce that's remote about 40% of the time, to now 100% of the time. So how does that impact what's going on, and what lessons did we learn making that change from having some office time or some one-on-one face-to-face time to now being 100% remote? And again, we had to overcome that challenge because of the field workforce that we have didn't change. They're still out there. They're still working in the field. They're still performing all of those same kind of construction activities. So how as we as a project management team handle that? I've got three major observations, if you will, or lessons learned that we've learned over the past 8 to 10 weeks, however long it's been, depending on the area that you're in. And I'll go through each one of these and talk about them just a little bit, and then we'll kind of open it up and see if anybody has questions or anything to add. My three observations and adjustments that we had to make. Number one, while communications are always important, I think we view that as the people running project, that communications are always important to what we do. As a matter of fact, I tell project managers that's the number one project skill that you need to have is excellent communications. In a remote workforce, communications get amplified, and they're now even more important because the level of communications that we have is directly related to the amount and level of engagement that you have within a remote team. It's very important to keep all of the team engaged with what's going on, and lacking other methods of communication becomes that really important piece. I like to talk about communications like walking into a room of 100 people, and if you ask 100 people, raise your hand if you're an above average driver, 85, 90% of the people are going to raise their hand, because the vast majority of us like to think that we're above average when it comes to those kind of driving skills. I think communications is much the very same way. I think if we go out and we ask people, are you an above average communicator? I think the majority of the people are going to raise their hands. And with that, we need to recognize that if communications is this number one thing, well, then we have to get better at it. Also, what we learned was that the communications we need to have had to have a lot more definition and a whole lot more detail to it, okay? Because it's harder when voice is the primary method that you're getting out of there. Yes, there's a lot of great technologies out there, but Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and whether you've got your video on or not, whether you're reading body language or not, those kind of things now become much harder to actually accomplish when we're out there. The other thing that I noticed was that there's a lot more of a reluctance to bring up issues and questions and things that are going on when you're just on a conference call or you're just on a video chat or anything like that. It's very easy for me to now mute my microphone. Maybe I'm paying attention. Maybe I'm answering emails while I'm doing it. Maybe I'm doing something else there. But there's a natural human nature reluctance to bringing up issues when we have that larger group. Now, we see this in normal times as well. But the difference is in normal times, then there can be a follow-up where a leader, another member of whatever that project team is, can now walk up and have that one-on-one face-to-face, and now all of a sudden that issue now comes out. So it's not in the greater team thing, it's in that one-on-one type of a setting. So one of the things that we found that has been very advantageous to us is even breaking up some of the project meetings and project teams we have into much smaller groups so that we can get more of that collaborative approach. A great example is we used to do a project update call every Thursday afternoon where project managers would update each other and me as to what the status and what problems they had with what their projects are. When you've got 22 people doing that, there's a real reluctance to really bring up an issue that you might have. When I trim that down into, now I'm doing 5 of those meetings Thursday afternoon. Now I've only got 4 or 5 people on the call. Now I find that there's a lot more engagement and there's a lot more participation. So communications is harder and we have to work harder at it. That brings up my next point. Point number 2 for me is engagement. Maintaining engagement takes more effort, okay? Increasing our contact time and the contact frequency that we have helps us really stay engaged and keeps us from feeling isolated. So my general rule, even with some of the geographically remote project managers I have, is if I haven't talked to you in a week and a half or so, I want to give you a call just to see how things are going on. Well, what I have found as we go through this 100% remote kind of a time period, now a lot of those interactions get lost and people are looking for those interactions and that engagement to really stay away from feeling isolated like they're all out there on their own. So now I've gone from, I call everybody every week and a half to 2 weeks to now it's every couple of days. And I'm spending a lot more time just picking up, whether it's a telephone, whether it's a video chat, however we do it, but spending a lot more time and energy just talking with people and seeing what's going on and trying to keep people engaged. I've also found that, again, to help combat that reluctance to bring up issues and issues that since I can't see you and I can't see you interact with the rest of your project team, I can't realize that there is a tension building up or there's an issue that's getting ready yet to rise up to become a bigger one of a problem. If I'm in a satellite office and I see one of the field supervisors walk in and they're having an interaction with a project manager and it's not a real positive interaction, not that it's negative, but it's not positive. There's not an agreement there. It's very easy to observe that and then to drill down and say, okay, what's going on here? You know, what can I help with? Or what can I provide? Maybe a little bit of coaching or a little bit of an adjustment to what we're doing, or what help do you need? And now that we get remote and I'm talking to people in home offices and those kind of things, I don't get to see that. I don't get to observe that, nor does anybody else. So if I'm going to maintain that engagement, not only do I have to call more frequently, and not only do I have to have that, but I also find myself asking a lot more leading questions, not just, hey, how's it going? How are you doing? Is there anything I can help you with? That was kind of how our conversations used to go. And then they would, you know, how'd your weekend go? You know, those kind of things. Now it's, okay, when was the last time you ran this project report? When was the last time you really did an analysis on this? So asking more detail of detailed kind of questions and more leading questions to try to increase that engagement that's there and get myself at least understanding a little bit more, and also get the project manager thinking a little bit more about where they're at on their project and what kind of things are going on with it. So point number one, communications are even more important. Point number two, maintaining engagement. Point number three for me was increased tracking and monitoring. If I'm going to have a better and more thorough understanding, and I'm going to be able to have our leadership team have a better and more thorough understanding of what's going on, then we've got to do a better job of tracking what's actually going on, because it's more difficult to see and hear potential issues. Again, I mentioned earlier that idea of observing an interaction. I'm an ex-military guy. We used to call it deck plate leadership. It's also known as a walk around leadership. Leadership by walking around, just walking around, having conversation, observing people in their natural environment, their natural work kind of place. As a leader, you can learn a tremendous amount by just observing and witnessing those kind of things that are going on. Well, that's gone now. You know, a lot of times the only interactions that I have with people are maybe once a week we're on something like this, where it is a video call and I get to eyeball people, but more often than not, it's me just picking up the telephone, talking to them 3 times a week, 4 times a week, whatever it needs to be. And so in order to have that go, that puts an additional challenge into, are we really recognizing what's really going on? It's a lot easier to hide behind just a telephone call than it is actually being in the office and seeing what kind of things are going on. And when I began into this thing to where we were all 100% remote, that really wasn't a concern for me. So it was kind of a surprise for me, because we do have project performance metrics that we monitor every single week. And I was relying on those to kind of say, oh yeah, I know what's going on with the project. And a big learning for me is that there's a lot of observation that we do as leaders watching our project teams that really goes a long way for us to understand what's going on with that. Again, it also goes back to asking those more penetrating kind of questions. And not only asking the penetrating questions from my direct reports, the project managers, but I have found it extremely beneficial to actually get out and start talking with some of the field supervisors. How are you doing as a field supervisor? Normally, I would have entrusted the project manager to handle that. And not that I don't trust them to handle it, but I find that I get much better understanding of operations and how that project is really going when I'm able to ask a broader range of people as to actually what's going on. One of the things that we also learned is, as we saw virtual teams, if you will, these smaller regional kind of project groups not performing as well as we would have liked them to do, the answer, I believe, for that is to increase the engagement. I think just by increasing engagement alone, you gain a lot of performance back on that, because it gets that team engaged with each other a lot more. So as you model engagement and you can increase the engagement that they have with each other within their project team, that goes a long way to improving what kind of performance that they have. And one of the other things that we've kind of melded into those other 3 things I talked about was using the performance issues or areas that we needed to improve on as means of collaborating. Instead of a problem just being brought up to me saying, hey, we need this, we need more training on this. Oh, okay. Typically what I would have done is I would have engaged who I needed to engage, and I would have put like a training program together, and we would have gone out and given that training program. Well, we don't necessarily have that availability now. I can't pull 4 or 5 people into an office and say, hey, now we're going to train on how to do this kind of cost forecasting or something of that nature. So now what we found has been very helpful within our project team is let's turn that into a collaborative approach. Okay, here's what our issue is. What does everybody think we ought to do about it? Because when we started engaging people at that level, when we start allowing them and putting more of an onus on them to actually deal with and develop what the solutions are, then we actually increase a lot of the engagement that we have out there. And that was a wonderful side benefit that we noticed from that. You know, a lot of times we look at this as a new technology that we had. I mean, 8 weeks ago, I had never used Zoom in my life. I hadn't even heard of it. You know, Microsoft Teams, we are just getting into using. We had used Skype before and those kind of things. But, you know, we have a tendency to think as leaders that, well, we've got this technology, so therefore I ought to be able to use it. And it shouldn't be a lot more effort, right? You know, I can look and I can read people's body language because we're all on this video chat together. But the reality is that it's much more difficult than that. And while the advanced technology that we have is a great platform to allow us to do some of these things, I mean, I can't imagine trying to have a 100% remote workforce where your only mechanisms are email and conference calls and telephone calls. That would be even more difficult to me. So while we've got the technology that's out there, I think it's important to remember that to have an effective team, to keep that team engaged, we've got to ramp up those all aspects of what kind of communication that we have to do, and that it really is all about building relationships and building that engagement that's out there. And it takes a little bit of a different leadership onus and a little bit of a different focused approach on it. But when you do that, I think the impacts are very, very good. And I think that good leaders incorporating those things are going to be able to engage their team and really be highly successful. When I look across our company as a whole, all 900 employees, the better leaders that are better at engagement, better at a team of collaboration, and better at these communication things, I've actually seen an increase in overall productivity and overall the performance of their groups. So those are the kind of things that we've learned over the last 8 weeks to 10 weeks. I guess we'll open up. Does anybody have questions, comments, anything they'd like to add?
Dwayne, this is Alex. Well, first of all, thanks for joining us today and as a panelist. And you spoke the whole 20 minutes. I feel bad that your throat, and it's a great information, and I very happy that you're able to share. I think it's impressive how structured the process is. We deal with a lot of different companies, large and small, and I would say an average, as I mentioned, the size of your company, and not everyone is at that structured approach, have a structured way of structured processes in place to deal with projects. So this is for most very, very impressive. I do appreciate your hard work on that as well. As far as the change, what you mentioned a few times, and the emphasis was on the engagement, right? And sort of, I think it almost leaning towards the communication 1.0. It was something that was before, like 8 weeks ago, right? And the communication, 2.0, this is the next level, the next version, which is the engagement. So, we used to probably took the engagement for granted as much as we could back in the day, because we could physically interact with those people. But now we have to step up that formal wisdom, the formal knowledge and institution of being a good communicators. and skills to being good communicators into the next level, which is, we can communicate with people. We're not really engaged into performing, into pushing the project forward, or to, pushing some of the things forward. I think this is, sort of eye-opening to me, in a sense that communication actually may have different levels of engagement, and then the first level, the second level, maybe the third level, where you have one-on-ones, where you have really effective communication with someone. When it's more than two people talking, it's really three people. It's a team already. So it's almost like a definition of the team. And if you need to communicate with a team, you need to address the right appropriate level of communication, which could be also labeled as engagement. I think very, very interesting concept.
Yeah, and I think you're 100% right, Alex. And for us, going through this 8, 9, 10 week process, it wasn't even a communications 1.0 and then 2.0. It was 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. I mean, we were making a number of adjustments while we were going along, recognizing that, okay, we're beginning to have people feel isolated and we're beginning to lose some certain things. So how do we get them back? How do we get them back? How do we get them more involved and engaged with what's going on? So you're absolutely right. It was an adjustment as we were going along. So
very, very cool. I would also we have quite a bit of audience today from the attendees. If you guys have any questions, I think we may have some of the questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, and we can kind of open the discussion a little bit more.
Yeah, at this point, doesn't look like we do. But yes, I would like to echo what Alex said, Dwayne. This was very valuable and very insightful. I mean, it's a very structured approach, and I guess you have been on the front lines all along. So it was very, very interesting to hear how you manage your team.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. I thought, with this change and transition, and in a sense, it was not as much of a transition. It was like an upgrade of the communication. You need more engagement, more communication, and it's harder. Did you see? Can you also mention something related to technology, as far as any metrics that you started, that you created in addition to you had before? And if you don't mind to share, which metrics did you use? Like maybe top 3, that would be beneficial for all the companies out there, especially in the same vertical, to kind of get that feedback. So some of those key KPIs, the metrics, the technology, and I have also a question about the resource management. But let's just address the performance metrics first.
All right. In terms of performance metrics, we did not develop any new performance metrics for this time period. So I don't have a communications or an engagement type of performance metrics. The performance metrics that we typically use in our work is a production, our productivity. How many utility poles do you set every day? How many feet of wire are you actually getting installed? So that kind of a tangible production. We also look at cost forecasting and project cost metrics as well. We call it a weekly scorecard, to where each project gets laid out on that weekly scorecard basis. So we didn't really change any of the metrics that we had around them. I think the one thing around metrics that we did kind of change a little bit was what our sensitivity was to metric trends. So in other words, if you had told me last year you had a gross profit margin of 11.8%, and then the next week you came in and you said, well, it's at 11.3% now, I would have said, well, what's going on? Well, we had some weather conditions and, this, that, or the other. And we probably would have let that explanation just go at that point. Now, if you were to walk in and say, I had 11.8% gross profit margin, now I'm down to 11.3. Now you're triggering an entire conversation to, instead of just a 1 or 2 sentence reason, we're asking more clarifying questions around trends and metrics when those metrics are moving a little bit, to get a better understanding, as well as to make sure that you as a project manager have a very engaged and a kind of detailed understanding of what's going on with your project. Because we can talk about engagement at the project manager level, but there's also this other project team between a project manager, between field supervisors, between the actual workers we have out there in the field. Is the project manager actually engaged with them and have a very good understanding about what's going on? So that was another metric focal point for us.
Thanks, Dwayne. I think this is great conversation. We're running out of time a little bit. If there are any other questions, please feel free to point out. Any questions from any of the other panelists here as well. Dwayne, I'm really glad that you came over. I think we can do this again at some point. I did want to ask you if you have a specific project management type of, what's the maybe you have like a portfolio type of reports, the way you would report to your leadership teams. If any of those, you don't have to open the whole secret over there, but just give us a little bit of a feeling of how do you guys manage to display the information in front of the leadership teams?
So our project reporting up to our executive leadership team really comes in 2 forms. One is those project metrics that we mentioned earlier are all available on a weekly basis. We put those into a package, and that goes all the way up to our owner and throughout all of executive leadership. So they have an opportunity to look at those hard performance metrics on a weekly basis. The other thing that we do is we do what we call a project status call. It's every other week for your work group, of where you verbally report out on a conference call or on a video call like this. You verbally report out on what your project is to the executive leadership team, allowing them to ask you any questions that they have. So it's not just a one-way reporting mechanism, much like a performance metric is, but it's a little bit of that, and then opening it up to allow the executive team. And we have a number of members on our executive team that are very engaged with the construction operations side of it. So it usually is interactive. There are good questions there, and there's some interaction that occurs.
Great. Well, looks like we're actually completely out of time. Again, thank you very much. Thanks all for joining us again. And we will keep it going, every Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully we'll get more exciting guests and some good topics that we can bring to you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Dwayne, for joining. This is great conversation. I appreciate it.
It was great. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you all.
Okay,
Thank you,
will do.
Svetlana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Dwayne, you wanted? If you I read your body language, and you wanted to say something, and I'm taking the opportunity to hear that.
Okay, so just one last thing that I wanted to mention very quickly, then I'll thank everybody and leave. One of the things that was a lot easier for us is that we already had some element of a remote engagement and kind of communications going on. But if you haven't had to do that in the past because of your work environment, I would strongly encourage you to come up with some means and to work on it even during this time that you have. It's much easier to make the transition from, we kind of sort of did some remote workforce stuff and now we're 100% a remote. So it was a lot easier for us versus I look at the accounting group that we had that were, nobody worked remote and then they had to go 100%. It was a lot more work for me to help them out to get them where they need to be. And again, I would like to thank Alex, Yuri, and everybody else who was on. This was very enjoyable and I would love to participate again in the future.
All right.
Actually, there's a quick question just came up. Hi, Dwayne.
I have all kinds of time, so.
If this phase were to carry on for 3 to 6 more months, are there plans in place to deal with it more effectively? Please.
Yeah, so right now, our home base operations is up in the beautiful state of Michigan. Our governor is on the front line of wanting to keep as much stuff closed down for as long as possible, which is, in one case we understand, and the other case is very frustrating for us. Certainly, this is an evolution in a process. So as we look for additional opportunities and see this going on, right now we don't anticipate workforce as a whole coming back into our offices until at least the middle of June, if not the end of June. As this goes on for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, then we will look for additional opportunities of how do we keep people engaged. One of the challenges that I've been faced with is since the beginning of 2020, I've hired 7 new project managers. So how do you get them engaged with the rest of the team when they've never met them one-on-one, face-to-face? Now, regionally, they've met the other project managers that they work around. But if you're a project manager up in Northern Michigan, you've probably never met the new person that's out in Iowa. So I'm itching to get all the project managers back together and are looking for other means and other opportunities that we can make that level of engagement happen while we're remote still.
Mhm.
So great question though.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. All right. So we are definitely over time at this point. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Dwayne. And
Thank you.
we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Good
Thank
talk.
you.
Thanks,
Thanks.
guys.